Alright. Dragon Rider. Chapter 15. Twigleg's second report. Twigleg was hurrying away through the twilight. The sun was sinking red beyond the ruins, and the columns cast long shadows across the sand. The stone faces carved on the old walls looked even eerier at night than by day. But the homunculus took no notice of them. He was used to ferocious stone heads grinning down at him in his master's castle. Just now he had other concerns on his mind. "Where, for heaven's sake," he muttered as the hot sand scorched his feet, "am I supposed to find water around here? There's nothing but ground baked as hard as my master's scales. The sun sucked up every last drop. Oh dear, he's going to be really furious with me for reporting back so late. Really, truly furious." The homunculus ran faster and faster. He hurried into ruined temples, investigated palm groves, and finally found himself sitting in the dry riverbed, entirely at a loss. "The wretched raven gone and disappeared too," he wailed. "What am I gonna do? Oh, whatever am I gonna do?" As the sun sank behind the scorched brown hills, black shadows reached out to Twigleg. Suddenly he clapped his hand to his forehead. "The sea!" he cried. "What a fool I am! The sea!" He jumped up so quickly that he fell over his own feet. Nimble as a squirrel, he raced along the dry riverbed, tumbled and slid down the dunes by the shore, and landed on the fine sand of the beach. The salty waves of the sea lapped the shoreline, and the sound of their breakers filled his ears. Surf sprayed in his face. Twigleg clambered up on a rock with the waves washing around it and spat into the dark water. Slowly, distorted by the movements of the waves, his master's image appeared. It grew larger and larger, spreading over the vast surface of the sea. "Where have you been all this time?" Nettleband roared. He was shaking so violently with fury that the dwarf Gravelbeard kept staggering to and fro on his back. "I couldn't help it," cried Twigleg, wringing his hands. "We got caught in a storm, then the raven left me in the lurch, and human beings caught me, and his voice broke. And then the boy freed me and took me with him, and I couldn't slip away at first, and then I couldn't find any water, and then, snarled the Nettlebrand. "Stop boring me with your useless twaddle. What have you found out?" "They're looking for the Rim of Heaven," said Twigleg. "Ah," spat Nettlebrand. "I already knew that, you fool. Did the raven eat what little brain you've got before he flew away? What else?" Twigleg mopped his damp brow. He was already drenched with sea spray. "What else? Oh, no end of things, but you're getting me all confused, master. I've been under a lot of strain, you know." Nettlebrand gave an impatient grunt. "Carry on cleaning," he growled at the dwarf, who had just settled down between the spines of his crest, hoping for a little nap. "Well," said Twigleg, "there was this other human being who told him a very strange story, all about dragons being attacked by a monster coming up out of the sea. Was that you, master?" "I don't remember," growled Nettlebrand, closing his eyes for a moment. "And I don't want to remember. Understand, Spiderlegs? They got away from me back then. They got away, even though I almost had them in my jaws. Forget that story. Never mention it again, or I'll eat you up too. The way I ate your 11 brothers." "I've forgotten already," said Twigleg hastily. "Completely forgotten. There's a black hole in that memory. Nothing but a black hole, master. Oh, there are so many black holes like that in my head." "Shut up!" Nettlebrand furiously slammed his paw down on the cracked flagstones of his castle floor. His image on the shining water grew to such an enormous size that Twigleg ducked his head in cover. The mannequin's knees were knocking, and his heart was thumping up and down like a rabbit on the run. "Well," said Nettlebrand in a dangerously soft voice, What else did you find out about the rim of heaven? Where are they going to look for it? Oh, I don't know. They're planning to visit a woman who's an expert on dragons and lives on the coast that I'm not to remind you of. Although she doesn't know where the rim of heaven is, and either, and that's why. That's why what? Bellowed Nettlebrand. That's why they're going to ask a Jinn. Twigleg babbled. A blue Jinn with 1,000 eyes. Apparently he knows the answer to any question, and he has to be asked by a human being, so the boy will have to do it. The homunculus fell silent. To his great surprise, he realized that he was feeling anxious about the human boy. It was a strange, unaccustomed sensation, and Twigleg couldn't understand how it had crept into his heart. Aha! Growled the Nettlebrand. Wonderful. We'll let the little human do the asking for us. How very useful. He stretched his hideous mouth into a nasty grin. So when do we get the answer, Spiderlegs? Oh, it's probably going to take us a few days to reach the Jinn. Twigleg faltered. You have to be patient a little longer, Master. Huh, grunted Nettlebrand. Patient? Patient? My patience has run out. I want to go hunting properly again. I'm sick of cows and sheep. Follow the boy and his friends and report back whatever you can. Do you hear? I want to know exactly where this dragon is. Have you got that? I've got it, Master, murmured Twigleg, pushing the wet hair back from his forehead. Nettlebrand's image on the sea began to fade. Wait, cried Twigleg. Wait a moment, Master. How am I going to follow them? The raven's flown off. Oh, you'll think of something. Nettlebrand's voice sounded a long way off as his image became more and more blurred. You're a clever little fellow. All was quiet now, except for the roaring of the sea. Twigleg looked at the dark waves unhappily. Then, sighing, he jumped down from the rock, landed on the damp sand, and laboriously climbed back up the cliffs. When he finally reached the top, gasping for breath, he saw Firedrake coming along the dry riverbed toward him with Ben, Sorrel, and the professor. The mannequin quickly ducked behind a tuft of grass. Now what? What should he say when they asked where he'd been? That brownie girl would definitely ask, oh, why hadn't they stayed in the cavern just a little longer? Then he could have slipped back, quiet as a mouse, and no one would have noticed that he had been away. Scarcely 3 human paces from Twigleg's hiding place, the 4 of them stopped. Well, friends, said the professor, here are the provisions I promised you. He handed Ben a full, bulging bag. I'm afraid I didn't have very much left myself, but I admit to borrowing a little dried fruit from my colleague's tent. There's sunscreen in there, too. You should make sure you keep using it, Ben. And here, he added, winding a pale cloth around the boy's head. This is what they wear in this country to protect themselves from the sun. It's called a kafia, and it ought to keep you from getting sunstroke, as we pale-skinned folk do only too quickly in these parts. As for you two, he added, turning to Sorrel and the dragon, your scales and fur are probably adequate protection. Now, about the route again. He switched on a flashlight, and he and Ben bent over the map together. From what you tell me of Firedrake's power of flight, the journey will probably take you about 4 days. First, as I told you earlier, you must keep flying south. Fortunately, you'll be traveling only by night, and by day you must choose the shadiest places you can find to rest in, for the heat will be fierce. There are any number of ruins along your way, tumble-down fortresses and sunken cities. Most of them were buried in the drifting desert sand long ago, but you'll always find somewhere to provide shelter, even for a dragon. Since you'll always be flying along the coast, he ran his finger down this coastline, you'll have a reliable guide even in the dark, and you should be able to see the coastal road clearly with the moon shining as bright as it is now. The road continues south. On the 4th night of your journey, the land will become more mountainous. Cities cling to the rocks there like the giant nests of giant birds. Then around midnight, you should reach a place where the road forks, and there's a signpost with Arabic lettering on it, like this. The professor wrote on the edge of the map with a ballpoint pen. I believe the name is given in English as well, but here's the Arabic, just to be on the safe side. It says Shibam, the name of a wonderful old city. Follow the road until it turns north. When you reach a ravine, that's the one you're after. It's a good thing Phaedric can fly, because there's no path leading down into the ravine. No human has ever tried to build a bridge over it. Barnabas smiled. Some say that it hides the entrance to hell, but I can tell you that's highly improbable. As soon as you've landed safely, look around for a big horn without any windows. Once you find it, honk the horn, sit down on the ground exactly 17 paces away from the car, and wait. A car? Said Ben, astonished. That's right, the professor shrugged his shoulders. A thief stole it from a rich sheik, or so the latest tales about him say. It's a mistake to believe that spirits and fabulous creatures always live in caves or ruined buildings. They sometimes have a distinct preference for what you might call modern accommodation. A few years ago, I found 2 jinns living in plastic bottles in the ruined city where I was looking for unicorns. Amazing, murmured Ben. What's so amazing? Ground elves like to live in empty cans sunk in the ground, Sorrel called down from Phaedrake's back. She had climbed up to check whether the safety straps were in good order, for the storm had shown Sorrel that on this journey it was a good idea even for her to lash herself firmly to the spines of the dragon's crest. Cans are wonderful way as a terrifying passerby, she went on. The elves just beat down the insides like acorn hammers. Sorrel chuckled. And you should see how it makes humans jump. The professor shook his head, smiling. I can well believe that of elves, he said, folding up the map and giving it back to Ben. About elves, by the way. There's a certain elf species you may meet on your way south. Sand elves swarm by night near the ruined cities that lie beneath them. They'll swirl around you and try to drive you off course. Take no notice, but don't be too rude to them. They can be a great nuisance, just like their relations in the cold north. Oh no, groaned Sorrel from the Phaedrake's back. Elves would be the end of me. She rolled her eyes. The trouble I've had with those pesky creatures. They once shot their nasty, itchy arrows at me just because I climbed an elf hill to pick some mushrooms. The professor chuckled. I'm afraid their Arab relations are no better behaved, so keep away from them if you can. Right. Ben put the map in his jacket pocket and looked up at the starry sky. The heat of the day had gone, and he felt a little chilly, but it was good to breathe cool air. Oh, and there's something else, my boy. Barnabas Greenbloom gave Ben a fat, well-thumbed book. Put this in your backpack, too. A little goodbye present from me. This book describes almost all the fabulous beings ever said to have existed in this world. It may come in useful on your journey. Oh, thank you, Professor. Ben accepted the book with a shy smile, stroked the cover reverently, and began leafing through it. Come on, put it away, Sorrel urged. We can't stay here while you're reading a book. See how high the moon has risen already. Yes, okay. Ben took off his backpack and put the map and the professor's book carefully away among his own things. Twigleg rose cautiously to his feet behind a tuft of grass. The backpacks! That was the solution! Sorrel certainly wouldn't want him going with them, however much the boy might. But if he simply hid in Ben's backpack, silent as a shadow, the homunculus stole over to it. What was that? Asked Sorrel, leaning down from Phaedrake's back. Something just shot out of the grass. Are there desert rats here? Diving headfirst in among Ben's clothes, Twigleg disappeared. I have something for you too, Sorrel, said Barnabas Greenbloom, reaching into his basket. My wife gave these to me to cook with, but I think you'll make better use of them. He pressed a small bag into Sorrel's paws. She sniffed it curiously. Dried wool blumets, she cried. Garrulous chanterelles, morals. She stared at Barnabas Greenbloom in amazement. Are you really giving this to me? Of course, the professor smiled. No one appreciates mushrooms better than a brownie. Am I right? You certainly are. Sorrel sniffed the bag happily once more and then leaped down off Firedrake's back to stuff it in her backpack, which was lying on the sand beside Ben's. Twigleg hardly dared to breathe as they strapped the two backpacks together, ready for the journey. But Sorrel was too intoxicated by the fragrance of her mushrooms to notice the mannequin among Ben's clothes. Ben looked all around him. Twigleg really does seem to have disappeared, he murmured. Thank goodness for that, said Sorrel, making sure the bag of mushrooms was pushed well down in her backpack, although not before she'd taken one out to nibble. He reeked of bad luck, you take my word for it. Any brownie would have spotted that at once, but you humans never notice anything. Twigleg would have loved to nip her furry fingers, but he controlled himself and didn't so much as poke the tip of his nose out of his hiding place. Perhaps it was just the fact that he is a homunculus you didn't like, Sorrel, said Professor Greenbloom. Such creatures are seldom popular with beings born naturally. In fact, they seem sinister to most people. So a homunculus like Twigleg often feels very lonely and rejected and clings to whomever made him, although they do usually live much longer than their makers. Much, much longer. Sorrel shook her head and closed her backpack. One way or another, she said. He smelled of bad luck, and that's all there is to it. She's stubborn as a mule, Ben whispered to the professor. I noticed, Barnabas Greenbloom whispered back. Then he went over to Firedrake and looked into his golden eyes once more. All I have for you is this, he said, holding out his open hand to the dragon. A scale lay on his palm, gleaming, hard and cold, and golden. The dragon bent over it, curious. The professor placed another scale beside it. I found these two scales many, many years ago in the northern Alps, the professor explained. Cows and sheep had been disappearing there, and the local people told horror stories of a terrible monster prowling down from the mountains by night. At the time, I'm afraid, I could find nothing but these scales, which look remarkably like your own, but feel entirely different. There were some tracks around, too, but they had been blurred by the rain and the angry farmers who had been milling around. In his hiding place, Twigleg pricked up his ears. Those scales could only have come from his master. Nettlebrand had lost 3 scales in the course of his life, and in spite of sending out all his ravens in search of them, he had never recovered any of them. He wasn't going to be at all pleased to hear that a human had found 2 of his precious scales. The mannequin stuck his nose out of Ben's backpack to get a look at them, but the professor's hand was too far above his head for him to see anything. They have no scent, said Firedrake, as if they were made of nothing. Yet they feel cold as ice. May I see them? Asked Ben, bending over the professor's hand. Twigleg was listening. You can hold them, said Professor Greenbloom. Look at them closely. They're curious things. Ben carefully took one of the scales from the professor's hand and ran a finger over its sharp edges. It did feel like metal, yet there was something else about it too. I believe they're made of false gold, the professor told him. A metal used by alchemists in the Middle Ages when they were trying to make the real thing. They never succeeded, of course, but this must be alloyed with something else, because that scale is very, very hard. I couldn't make the slightest scratch on it, even with a diamond cutter. Ah well. Barnabas Greenbloom shrugged his shoulders. Take one with you. You might unravel this mystery too on your travels. I've been carrying these scales around with me for so long that I've given up hope. Shall I put it in with our things? Ben asked the dragon. Firedrake nodded. Thoughtfully, he raised his head and looked out at sea. Sorrel scurried up onto the dragon's tail. Ben threw her the backpacks, and she caught them and slung them over Firedrake's back. "Here we go!" she cried. "Who knows, tomorrow morning we might even land where we meant to for a change." "The weather seems fair, Sorrel," said the professor, looking up at the sky. Ben went over to him and shyly offered his hand. "Goodbye, Professor," he said. Professor Greenbloom took Ben's hand and pressed it hard. "Goodbye, Ben," he said. "I really do hope we'll meet again." "Oh, yes," he added, handing Ben a small card. "I almost forgot this. It's Zubeida's card. If you do visit her after you've stopped off to see the djinn, give her my regards. And should you need more provisions or anything else, I'm sure she'll be happy to help you. If the village where she's working hasn't changed too much, then its people will still be waiting hopefully for the dragons to return. But you'd better make sure of that before Firedrake walks in on them." Ben smiled and put the card away with his other treasures. Then he clambered up on Firedrake's back. "You've still got my card too, I hope," said Professor Greenbloom. Ben nodded. "The best of luck, then," cried the professor, as Firedrake spread his wings. "And think hard about the question you asked the djinn. Beware of basilisks. And write to tell me if you do find the dragons." "Goodbye," called Ben, waving. Then Firedrake rose into the air. The dragon circled once over the professor, breathed a blue flame into the night as a farewell, and flew away. That was fun.